A 2-week siege in Gaza's Al-Shifa Hospital appears to be over, as Israeli military announced forces have pulled out from the medical facility. According to the Israeli Defense Forces, troops had completed precise operational activity in the area of the hospital and exited the area. The IDF, as it killed terrorists and found numerous weapons and intelligence documents in the area while preventing harm to civilians, patients, and medical teams. The incursion into Al-Shifa happened after Israel said it had intelligence indicating Hamas was using the hospital as a base to launch attacks and carry out operations, an allegation Hamas has denied. However, the World Health Organization noted that 21 patients have died since Israel began a siege on the facility on March 18th. Happening in Palestine, Mustafa has been sworn in as head of the government and prime minister. The new government consists of 23 ministerial portfolios, including at least 6 ministers from the Gaza Strip, and Prime Minister Mustafa also serves as the foreign minister. On March 14th, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas tasked Mustafa, the head of the Palestine Investment Fund and a longtime economic advisor to Abbas, to form the 19th government. His appointment came after the former government resigned in light of challenging circumstances amid the developments in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Jerusalem, as well as mounting pressure on Abbas to reform the Palestinian Authority and establish a political framework capable of governing a future Palestinian state in the aftermath of the Gaza conflict. This weekend was anything but peaceful in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of people gathered to demand the government secure a ceasefire deal that would also free Israeli captives held by Hamas in Gaza and called for early elections. The demonstrators claimed the protest was the biggest since Israel launched its war in October. The Israeli Prime Minister's government has faced widespread criticism over the security failure of the October 7 Hamas-led attack on southern Israel, in which 1,139 people were killed and about 250 others taken to Gaza. A truce between Israel and Hamas in November led to the release of more than 100 captives in exchange for the release of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. A new round of talks on a ceasefire and captive prisoner exchange was expected to start on Sunday in Egypt's capital, Cairo, although Hamas said the group had not decided whether to send a delegation. Speaking of Gaza, an Israeli airstrike on Sunday struck the courtyard of Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza, killing at least 2 people and injuring several others, including a photographer with Viro News Agency. The attack reportedly targeted a tent where displaced individuals sought shelter. People scampered for safety after the strike hit one of several tents in the courtyard of the Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah, where thousands of displaced people have been sheltering for months. The government media office in Gaza condemned the attack, stating it struck a tent housing displaced persons. Let's bring in the VOA's Ricky Rosson. She's in Tel Aviv. Hi, Ricky. Great to see you. Happy Easter. Let's talk about the protests that took place on Sunday in Jerusalem. It seemed like a fairly large one, but the message is even more sobering. I would say for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had hernia surgery also on Sunday. Why the agitation now?
I was reporting from the big protest in Jerusalem last night, and it really was reminiscent of the huge anti-government protests that we saw before October 7th and the war in Gaza. And judging from what demonstrators told me and the many protest signs I saw, I think there are several reasons why people came out onto the streets now, after 6 months of relative quiet while the war has been going on. Firstly, many of the families of the hostages still being held in Gaza and their thousands of supporters are turning against Netanyahu because they think he has given up opportunities to get a hostage release deal with Hamas because of the difficult concessions that were being demanded, which were being rejected by some of the extremist members of Netanyahu's coalition. And secondly, the groups of army reservists who were leaders of the massive protest movements last year are currently outraged by Netanyahu's attempts to continue the exemption of ultra-Orthodox Jewish young men, exemption from serving in the army. 66,000 of them were exempted last year, even at the same time as the war was raging, and 300,000 army reservists were called up. And this is happening in the face of a Supreme Court decision which demands that these exemptions have to stop immediately, meaning today.
Yes, and I also remember saying that, some of the protesters also were concerned about, the intelligence that was supposed to have, come up before the Israeli, before the Hamas attacks. It's clear Israelis are concerned about, what happened before October 7th, on October 7th itself, for an army that's said to be around the best in the world. And then there's, of course, a loss of lives in Gaza. But it seems more of a domestic problem. What really is going on in Israel politically and internally that would have caused these protests? Because I'm sure this is not the last we've seen.
No, it's only the beginning. It was announced that this week we'll see 4 days of major protests. Hundreds of tents were set up in front of the Knesset, and I think it's really the beginning of a new round of massive protests. And as you said, people in Israel are growing increasingly disturbed by the images of death and destruction in Gaza, but they really are focused more on domestic issues, and they feel, as I said, that Netanyahu and his government are working mainly to preserve their own coalition, so that, for example, they made a budget to pay for millions of dollars that were promised to special interests in the coalition, rather than paying for example, the resettling Israelis who had to evacuate the area close to the Gaza border after the October 7th attacks, or close to the Lebanon border in the face of nearly daily bombardment by Hezbollah rockets. So I saw at the demonstration a symbol of Israeli anger towards the government, which they say only takes care of itself, was a kind of exhibition in which there were tens of suitcases with signs that said, "You, the government ministers, declared a 6-week vacation for yourselves starting next week, but the hostages in Gaza don't get a vacation, and the soldiers fighting don't get a vacation."
That is rather sobering, isn't it? And it does seem like, Ricky, well, let me just ask if, those corruption charges against the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could be resuscitated in light of recent happenings.
He was supposed to go to court in February. It was delayed again because of the war. And I think people are more concerned about getting him and his extremist government out of power, and then later seeing what would happen with his corruption cases. But people aren't really focused on the corruption cases as they were last year and in years before when he was in power.
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Minister Yariv Levin is acting now as Prime Minister while Netanyahu recovers from the hernia surgery. Does he have the power to change things under his watch while Netanyahu recovers?
No. Netanyahu got out of surgery and recovery after 4 hours at about 1:30 this morning. And he started later in the morning to hold meetings from the hospital, and will be discharged tomorrow. So his deputy, Yariv Levin, is no longer in charge.
Okay. And the fighting is still ongoing in Gaza. Hospitals still being bombed. Read some of that today. Access to food and supplies remain a challenge. We've discussed that over time. 2 people have been killed in Israeli attacks in Al-Aqsa. Journalists also injured. Are there any chances of, these attacks being let up? You think that Netanyahu could bow to domestic pressure to tone down some of these attacks in Gaza?
I think Netanyahu, only if there was an imminent hostage deal would he agree to tone down the attacks. The army spokesman announced that they considered the 2-week operation in Shifa Hospital, which, as you announced, was just finished today. They considered it a very successful and necessary operation because they succeeded in killing and arresting hundreds of Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters, including some high-ranking leaders. And apparently they were concentrated there at the hospital to coordinate renewed attacks against Israeli soldiers and civilian sites inside Israel. And the Israeli army intelligence knew this and waited for this concentration to begin before surrounding the hospital. And they've and they said that they evacuated patients and doctors to a field hospital before the attack. And they announced that the attack on the Al-Aqsa hospital was done for the same reasons, that there was a concentration of Islamic Jihad fighters there. And the attack killed 4 people, at least 4 people. It's not certain whether these were civilians or militants who were operating at the hospital. And the wounded included, as you said, journalists who were staying in tents outside the hospital compound.
It's becoming a bit more difficult, Ricky, for, I guess, the world to understand Israel's intentions in Gaza. So the negotiations are supposed to be going on in Cairo. They were supposed to have restarted yesterday. Hamas has not indicated it sent a delegation. Do you know if the Israeli government has a delegation attending the ceasefire proposals?
Yes, Netanyahu sent officials from not the heads, the directors of the Mossad and the Shin Bet security agencies, but officials from those agencies are now in Cairo holding negotiations about a possible hostage deal, which would continue. If there was a possibility, they would continue more seriously in Qatar later this week. But apparently the Mossad chief announced last week that a deal was still possible if Israel would be more lenient about allowing Gazans to return to the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And Israel has been reluctant because they're afraid that Hamas fight.
I do apologize. Seem to have lost connection with Ricky Rosson of the VOA in Tel Aviv. Ricky is back. Just pick up from where you left off. Yeah, go on.
I was saying that, in fact, the operation at Shifa Hospital was aimed at the Hamas militants who returned to that part of Gaza, which had been cleared back in December of the Hamas militant battalions, but they were able to return probably through the tunnels, and that's what Israel is afraid would happen if they agreed to that term that's being demanded by Hamas.
Yeah. Relations between the United States and Israel has been frayed over the UN Security Council resolution on the ceasefire, the one that was taken last week. Has Israeli government shifted its position regarding that meeting in Washington?
They were supposed to have a virtual meeting without sending the representatives of the government actually to Washington. They were supposed to have that virtual meeting today, but we don't know yet what the results were. But there is still a lot of tension between Netanyahu and the Biden administration because they refused to veto that Security Council resolution.
Ricky, thanks again for your reporting on this issue.
Thank you.